Hello, everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The Ghost Convoy. I've been driving truck for 23 years, and I've seen plenty of strange things out there on the road. But there's one night I still can't explain, and I've never told anyone about it until now. It was late October, maybe 3 years back, and I was hauling refrigerated goods down Interstate 80 through Nevada, one of those long, empty stretches where you can drive for an hour without seeing another soul, the kind of road that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. Around 2 in the morning, I started hitting patches of fog. Nothing unusual at first, just wisps rolling across the asphalt like ghostly fingers reaching out from the darkness. But as I kept driving, that fog got thicker and stranger, not spreading out like normal fog does, but following the road, hugging the yellow line like it had somewhere important to be. I slowed down and turned on my hazards, watching as the mist seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of its own. The CB was quiet, not even static, which should have been my first warning. There's always chatter on the CB, especially on Interstate 80. Truckers talking about speed traps and weather conditions, sharing stories and keeping each other company through the long, lonely hours. But that night brought only dead silence, as if the fog had swallowed every voice on the highway. The fog kept getting thicker until I could barely see my own headlights cutting through it. I was doing maybe 30 miles an hour on a highway where I should have been doing 70. But here's the thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. In my side mirrors, I could see clear road behind me, crystal clear, like the fog was only in front of my truck, moving with me, like some kind of supernatural escort. I pulled over at the next rest area, figuring I'd wait it out, but when I stepped out of the cab, the air was clear. No fog anywhere. I could see stars twinkling overhead, other trucks parked nearby, everything perfectly normal. But when I looked back at the highway, there it was, that wall of fog, sitting right at the entrance ramp, waiting for me like a patient predator. I grabbed my coffee mug and walked over to another driver, asking him if he'd seen the fog bank on the highway. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head, said the road was clear as glass for miles in both directions. I walked back to my truck feeling confused and unsettled, but as soon as I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, that fog rolled in again, thick as cotton, moving with me like it was tethered to my bumper. For the next 100 miles it stayed with me, a faithful companion made of mist and mystery. Every time I'd slow down, it would slow down. When I'd speed up, it would speed up, maintaining perfect synchronization with my rig. The whole time, my CB radio stayed dead quiet, not even the sound of static to break the eerie silence. Then around 4 in the morning, I started hearing something in that fog, a rumbling sound like another truck's engine, but deeper, older, like one of those big rigs from the 70s with no muffler. I couldn't see anything in my mirrors except that clear road behind me, but I could hear it getting closer, the sound growing louder until it was right beside me. That's when I saw the headlights, 2 yellow beams cutting through the fog to my left. An old Peterbilt, maybe a 79, keeping pace with me in the passing lane. But here's what made my blood run cold. I could see right through it. The truck was there, but it wasn't there. Like looking at a ghost made of metal and memories. I tried to speed up, but my truck wouldn't go faster than 35. The engine was running fine, but it was like something was holding me back, keeping me synchronized with whatever phantom was running alongside me. That ghost truck stayed right beside me, matching my speed exactly, and I could hear its engine, see its lights, but whenever I tried to look directly at it, it would fade just a little, like it was made of the same fog surrounding us. Then I heard something that made me nearly jackknife right there on the highway. A voice on my CB radio, clear as day even though the channel had been dead for hours. "You're in my lane, driver," the voice said, old and scratchy, like someone who'd been smoking unfiltered cigarettes for 40 years. I grabbed my mic with shaking hands. "Come back, driver, what's your location?" Nothing but static. Then the voice came again. "Been driving this road longer than you've been breathing. This is my route." I looked over at that ghost truck, and for just a second I could see into the cab. There was someone behind the wheel, but I couldn't make out his face, just the silhouette of a man in a baseball cap, hands on the steering wheel, like he'd been driving that same stretch of highway for decades. "Listen, I don't want any trouble," I said into the mic. "Just trying to get my load delivered." The static cleared for a moment, and I heard something that still makes me lose sleep. The sound of laughter. A low, hollow laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your load's already been delivered, son," the voice said. "Question is, were you taking mine?" Story 2. The Midnight Diner. There's a stretch of Highway 50 in Colorado that most drivers avoid if they can help it. They call it the loneliest road in America, and there's a good reason for that. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes the load you're carrying and the deadline you're facing means you take the road that's available, no matter what stories you might have heard whispered in truck stop diners. I learned that lesson 3 years ago on a run from Denver to Salt Lake City. It was my first time on that route, and I was making good time until my rig started acting up around sunset. The engine was running rough, temperature gauge creeping toward the red like a fever climbing in a sick patient. I needed to find a place to pull over and check things out before I blew the motor completely. That's when I saw the sign glowing in my headlights like a beacon of hope. Rest area 2 miles, mile marker 237. I'd never been so happy to see a rest stop in my life, coasting in just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving everything painted in that purple twilight that makes the whole world look like a faded photograph. The place was bigger than I expected. Maybe a dozen parking spots for trucks, restrooms, picnic tables, the works. But it was completely empty, not another soul in sight. Should have seemed peaceful, but something about it felt wrong, like the place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I popped the hood and started checking the engine. The radiator hose had split, which explained the overheating. Simple fix, but I'd need to let everything cool down first. I figured I'd grab some dinner from my cooler and wait it out, enjoy the quiet mountain air and the spectacular view of stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. That's when I noticed the picnic table. Nothing special about it at first glance. Standard issue concrete table with wooden bench seats, the kind you see at rest stops across the country. But as I got closer, I could see something carved into the surface. Names, dates, messages, the kind of graffiti you see everywhere truckers stop to rest. But these weren't normal trucker tags. They were all the same message carved over and over again in different handwriting. Still here at 237. Some of the carvings looked fresh, the wood still pale where the knife had bitten deep. Others were weathered, filled with dirt and moss like they'd been there for years, decades even. I counted maybe 30 different versions of the same message scattered across every inch of that table, each one carved by a different hand, each one telling the same desperate story. I was studying the carvings when I heard footsteps on gravel behind me. "Engine trouble?" a voice said, and I turned around, nearly jumping out of my skin. There was a man standing maybe 10 feet away, an older guy, maybe 60, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they'd seen better decades. What spooked me wasn't that he'd appeared out of nowhere. It was his face. Something about it seemed faded, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Radiator hose. Should be able to fix it once things cool down." He nodded and walked over to look at my engine, moving like he knew his way around a truck, which wasn't unusual. A lot of old-timers on the road who'd been driving since before I was born. "Name's Frank," he said, extending a hand. When I shook it, his skin felt wrong, too cold, too dry, like shaking hands with old leather that had been left out in the desert sun. "Bill," I replied. "You broken down too?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Something like that. Been here a while now." I looked around the empty rest area. "Where's your truck?" Frank pointed toward the far end of the parking area where the spots disappeared into shadow. I squinted but couldn't make out any vehicles over there. "Old Pete 359, he said with pride in his voice. "Beautiful truck, been driving her for, must be going on 20 years now?" We talked for a while about trucking, about the road, about the kind of loads we'd hauled over the years. Frank had stories from all over the country, and he told them like a man who'd been everywhere and seen everything. But there was something off about the details. He mentioned places that didn't exist anymore, truck stops that had been torn down years ago, CB channels that nobody used. As we talked, more truckers started showing up, appearing one by one, walking out of the shadows like they'd been there all along, waiting for their cue to join the conversation. A woman named Sarah in a Kenworth ball cap, her face carrying that same faded quality as Frank's. A young guy called Tommy who couldn't have been more than 25, but his eyes held the wariness of someone much older. An old Mexican driver named Luis who spoke English with a thick accent. His weathered hands telling stories of decades on the road. All of them had the same faded look as Frank, and all of them claimed to be having mechanical problems. All of them kept mentioning mile marker 237 like it was some kind of landmark they'd been searching for their whole lives, a destination that had somehow become a prison. Story 3. The Phantom Truck. I've been driving truck for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. Perfect weather runs where everything goes smooth as silk, nightmare trips through blizzards and ice storms, breakdowns in the middle of nowhere that test your mechanical skills and your patience. But there's one run that happened about 5 years ago that still keeps me awake at night because it involved cargo that shouldn't have existed and a delivery that changed everything I thought I knew about life and death. I got the call on a Friday afternoon from a dispatcher I'd never worked with before, representing a small freight company out of New Orleans. They needed a driver to transport a single item from a funeral home in Louisiana to a cemetery in rural Mississippi. Rush delivery, premium pay, and the kind of money that makes you not ask the questions you probably should ask. The funeral home was located on the outskirts of New Orleans, a stately old building that looked like it had been in business since before the Civil War. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like ghostly curtains, and the air was thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms. The funeral director was waiting for me when I arrived. An older man in a perfectly pressed black suit with a kind of pale complexion that comes from spending too much time around the dead. He led me around to the back of the building where a single casket was waiting on the loading dock. It was an expensive-looking coffin, solid mahogany with brass handles that gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight, the kind that costs more than most people make in a year. But there was something about it that made me uncomfortable, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was the way the wood seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it, or the fact that it felt cold even in the humid Louisiana heat. The brass handles were ice cold to the touch, and when I helped load it into my trailer, I could have sworn I heard something moving inside the casket. A soft scratching sound like fingernails on wood. "Special delivery," the funeral director said as we secured the coffin with extra straps and chains. "Needs to be at Magnolia Hill Cemetery by midnight. Very important that you don't open the trailer between here and there. And absolutely critical that you don't disturb the cargo in any way." I wanted to ask why, but something in his eyes told me I was asking the wrong kind of questions. The family has very specific requirements about how their loved one is to be transported, he explained. No stops, no delays, no disturbances. This is a very delicate situation that requires the utmost discretion and professionalism. The drive to Mississippi should have taken about 3 hours, but I was making the run at night to avoid traffic and curious eyes. Small-town folks tend to get nervous when they see a truck carrying a coffin through their main streets, and the last thing I needed was unwanted attention from local law enforcement or curious bystanders. For the first hour, everything went normally. Good weather, light traffic, my truck running smooth and steady. I had the CB turned up and was listening to the usual late-night chatter between drivers heading east and west on Interstate 10. The familiar voices that become like a second family when you spend your life on the road. Then around 10 o'clock, I started hearing sounds from my trailer. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaking and settling that happens when you're hauling a heavy load. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds became more distinct and more disturbing. Tapping, scratching, and something that sounded almost like knocking, as if someone was trying to get my attention from inside that sealed trailer. I pulled over at the next truck stop and walked back to check my trailer, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. Everything looked secure. The doors were still locked, the seals were intact, and the coffin was exactly where I'd left it, strapped down tight and secure. But when I put my ear to the trailer wall, I could definitely hear movement inside. And it wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from a dead body. A rational person would have called the funeral home and asked for instructions, would have demanded an explanation for what was happening in the back of their truck. But the funeral director had been very clear about no stops, no delays, no disturbances, and the pay was too good to risk by asking uncomfortable questions that might not have comfortable answers. I got back in my cab and continued driving toward Mississippi, but the sounds from the trailer got louder and more insistent as the night wore on. By 11 o'clock, it sounded like someone was banging on the inside of the coffin with both fists. But that was impossible. The funeral director had told me the deceased was being transported to their final resting place, and dead people don't bang on coffin lids. Hey, do they? Story 4. The Loop Road. There are some roads that seem to have been designed by people who didn't understand the basic principles of getting from point A to point B. Highway 191 through eastern Utah is one of those roads, a narrow 2-lane nightmare with steep grades, hairpin turns, and no shoulder to speak of. The kind of road that's dangerous enough in daylight and potentially fatal at night, which is why most experienced truckers avoid it whenever possible. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes the load you're carrying and the deadline you're facing means taking the road that's available, regardless of its reputation among drivers who value their lives and their equipment. That's how I found myself on Highway 191 at 2 in the morning on a cold November night, hauling electronic equipment from Salt Lake City to Albuquerque. I was running behind schedule because of bad weather in Colorado, and 191 was the only route that would get me to my delivery appointment on time. The weather was clear, which was a blessing, and traffic was almost non-existent, which made the narrow road slightly less terrifying than it would have been during daylight hours. The first sign that something was wrong came about 30 miles south of Interstate 70. I passed a mile marker that read Mile 247, which seemed normal enough. Mile markers are supposed to count down as you travel south, and I was making good time despite the challenging road conditions. But 20 minutes later, I passed the same mile marker again. Same number, same faded green sign, same distinctive rock formation in the background. I figured I must have been more tired than I thought, maybe hallucinating from too much coffee and not enough sleep. Long-haul trucking can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're driving alone through empty country in the middle of the night. But when I passed mile 247 for the third time, I knew something was seriously wrong. I pulled over and checked my GPS, thinking maybe there was an error in the satellite signal or a glitch in the mapping software. But according to the device, I was making steady progress south on Highway 191, exactly where I should be, covering miles at a reasonable pace. The GPS showed no indication that I was driving in circles or retracing my route, but the mile markers told a different story. Mile 247, mile 246, mile 245, then, inexplicably, mile 247 again, like I was trapped in some kind of highway purgatory. I tried calling dispatch on my satellite phone, but I couldn't get a signal. The device showed no bars, no connection to the outside world. I tried the CB radio, but there was nothing except static, the kind of white noise that makes you feel completely alone in the universe. For the next 2 hours, I kept careful track of the mile markers, writing down each number as I passed it, like a scientist documenting a strange phenomenon. The pattern was always the same. I'd make progress for maybe 10 miles, passing markers 247 down to 237, watching the numbers count down like they were supposed to. Then suddenly, without any memory of turning around or changing direction, I'd be back at mile 247, starting the same 10-mile stretch all over again. It was like I was trapped in a loop, doomed to drive the same section of highway for eternity. Around 4 in the morning, I started seeing other vehicles on the road. A pickup truck with Wyoming plates, a motorcycle with a rider wearing no helmet, a sedan that looked like it was from the 1980s. But every time I tried to get closer to another vehicle, to signal them or get their attention, they would disappear around a curve or over a hill, leaving me alone again on the endless loop of Highway 191. That's when I started noticing the details that should have been obvious from the beginning. The landscape never changed. I was driving through the same stretch of red rock desert over and over again, passing the same distinctive formations, the same twisted juniper trees, the same abandoned ranch buildings. It was like someone had created a 10-mile section of highway and programmed it to repeat infinitely, a nightmare version of the road that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The fuel gauge in my truck should have been dropping steadily, but it remained exactly where it had been when I first noticed the mile marker problem. My odometer should have been recording hundreds of miles, but it stayed frozen at the same reading, like time itself had stopped. And most disturbing of all, the clock on my dashboard had stopped at 2:17 in the morning, the exact moment when I first realized I was trapped. Story 5. The Hitchhiker. Some runs stick with you longer than others. Usually it's the good ones that you remember. Perfect weather, easy load, truck running smooth as silk, making good time with no complications or delays. But sometimes it's the runs that go wrong that you can't forget. The ones that leave you questioning what you really saw out there in the dark, wondering if your mind was playing tricks on you, or if you encountered something that doesn't fit into the world we think we understand. This happened to me about 5 years ago on a late-night haul through Kansas. I was pulling a load of farm equipment from Topeka to Oklahoma City, running behind schedule because of construction delays that had turned what should have been a simple run into a frustrating game of stop-and-go traffic. It was one of those drives where you're fighting to stay awake, chugging coffee and slapping yourself to keep your eyes open. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was on a stretch of 2-lane highway that cuts through wheat country, nothing but fields on both sides as far as the eye could see. Farmhouses were scattered here and there with their porch lights glowing like lonely stars, the kind of road where you might see another car every 20 minutes if you're lucky. That's when my headlights picked up something unusual ahead. A girl was standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 18 or 19 years old, wearing a light blue dress that looked too thin for the cool October air. She had long dark hair that seemed to move in a wind I couldn't feel, and she was holding what looked like a small suitcase, the kind people use to carry when traveling by bus or train. As I got closer, she stepped toward the road and held up her thumb in the universal gesture of someone looking for a ride. Now, I've got a strict policy about picking up hitchhikers, learned the hard way from too many stories of drivers getting robbed, or worse. But this girl looked scared, standing out there in the middle of nowhere with no other traffic around. and there was something about her that reminded me of my own daughter. I started to slow down, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way she was standing so perfectly still, like a statue that had been placed there by some unseen hand. Maybe it was the fact that her dress wasn't moving in the wind that was strong enough to rock my trailer. Whatever it was, some instinct told me to keep driving. In my mirror, I watched her get smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the darkness behind me, but I couldn't shake the image of her face in my headlights. Pale, desperate, and somehow familiar, like I'd seen her before, in a dream or a half-remembered nightmare. About 10 miles down the road, I started feeling guilty. What kind of man leaves a young girl stranded on a dark highway in the middle of the night? My wife would have been ashamed of me, and hell, I was ashamed of myself. I found a wide spot in the road and turned around, my conscience getting the better of my common sense. The drive back took maybe 15 minutes, but when I reached the spot where I'd seen her, there was nobody there. I slowed to a crawl, scanning both sides of the highway with my spotlight. Nothing but empty road and wheat fields stretching out into the darkness like an ocean of grain. I pulled over and stepped out of the cab, thinking maybe she'd seen another ride and was hiding in the ditch, or had walked off into the fields looking for help. I called out a few times, my voice echoing across the empty landscape, but the only answer was the wind moving through the grain like whispered secrets. That should have been the end of it. Should have climbed back in my truck and continued on to Oklahoma City, chalked the whole thing up to fatigue and too much caffeine. But as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed something in the gravel near where she'd been standing. A small piece of fabric, light blue, like the dress she'd been wearing. I picked it up and held it under my flashlight, studying it carefully. The material felt strange, too old, too brittle, like it had been sitting in the sun for years. But I'd just seen her 20 minutes ago, and the dress had looked new. I pocketed the fabric and got back on the road, but I couldn't stop thinking about that girl. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together, like I'd witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. About 50 miles later, I stopped at an all-night truck stop to fuel up and grab some more coffee. The place was nearly empty except for one other driver and a bored-looking attendant behind the counter. While I was waiting for my tank to fill, the other driver, an older guy with a gray beard and tired eyes, walked over and struck up a conversation. Story 6, The Desert Rose. You spend enough time on the road and you get to know the voices on Channel 19. There are regulars who run the same route, same times, week after week, and you start to recognize their call signs, their speech patterns, the stories they tell to pass the miles. It becomes like a second family, scattered across thousands of miles of highway, connected by radio waves and diesel fuel, and the shared experience of life on the road. That's why what happened last winter shook me up so bad, because I knew the voice I heard that night, and I knew it shouldn't have been possible. I was running a load of electronics from Chicago to Phoenix, taking Interstate 40 through the Arizona desert. Middle of February, dead of winter, but the desert gets cold at night in ways that surprise people who think of Arizona as nothing but sunshine and heat. I had the heater running and the CB turned up, listening to the usual chatter between drivers heading east and west. Around midnight, just past Flagstaff, the regular conversation died down to almost nothing. That's not unusual on the late shift. Fewer drivers on the road, and most of the regulars had probably found places to park for their mandatory rest breaks. But then I heard a voice I recognized, call sign Desert Rose, and she was asking for a radio check. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose, looking for a radio check. Anybody got their ears on out there? I'd been hearing Desert Rose on and off for maybe 3 years. Always professional, always helpful with road conditions and weather updates. She had a voice like honey over gravel, tough but smooth, the kind of voice that made you feel safer somehow when you were driving alone through the dark. Desert Rose, you got the Midnight Cowboy here, I replied. You're coming in 5 by 5. How about eastbound traffic conditions? Thanks for the check, Midnight Cowboy. Roads looking good all the way to Albuquerque. No bears in the bushes, no construction delays. You stay safe out there. Standard trucker conversation. Nothing unusual about it except for one thing that made my blood run cold. I'd been to Desert Rose's funeral 6 months earlier. Her real name was Linda Martinez, and she'd been driving truck for 15 years before a drunk driver crossed the median on Interstate 10 near Tucson and hit her head-on. Half the trucking community in Arizona showed up for the service, and I'd met her in person twice at truck stops. There was no mistaking that voice, that distinctive accent and cadence that made her sound like she'd been born with a CB microphone in her hand. But there it was, clear as day on Channel 19, talking to me like nothing had happened. I keyed my mic with shaking hands. Desert Rose, this is Midnight Cowboy again. Can I ask your 20? Mile marker 201 on Interstate 40 westbound, just past the Meteor Crater exit. Beautiful night out here. Midnight Cowboy. You can see every star in the sky. I checked my GPS and felt my heart skip a beat. I was at mile marker 195, 6 miles behind her. If I pushed it, I could catch up in maybe 10 minutes, but part of me was terrified of what I might find. Desert Rose, I'm about 6 miles back of you. Mind if I catch up? Always nice to have company on these long desert runs. There was a pause before she answered, and I could hear something in her voice that hadn't been there before. A sadness that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very far away. Sure, Midnight Cowboy, I'll keep it between the lines. For the next 10 minutes, I pushed my rig harder than I probably should have, watching for taillights ahead that never appeared. Mile marker 21 came and went, with no sign of another truck. Just empty highway stretching out into the desert darkness. I kept calling on the radio, but Desert Rose had gone quiet, like she'd faded back into whatever realm she'd emerged from. Then, around mile marker 210, I heard her voice again, but this time she wasn't talking to me. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose with an important message for all drivers on Interstate 40 tonight. There's black ice forming near mile marker 237. I repeat, black ice at mile marker 237. Slow it down and keep your distance. I grabbed my mic with trembling hands. Desert Rose, this is Midnight Cowboy. Where are you now? I've been looking for your rig but can't seem to catch up. Silence for a moment. Then her voice came back, softer than before. Midnight Cowboy, you don't need to catch up to me. Just need you to pass along that message about the black ice. Other drivers need to know. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. A realization that was both terrifying and somehow beautiful. Story 7. The Shadow in the Mirror. Most truckers will tell you that your sleeper cab becomes like a second home after a while. You spend so many nights in that little space behind the driver's seat that you know every sound, every creak, every way the light falls through the curtains when dawn breaks over another anonymous highway. It becomes comfortable, familiar, a safe place to rest when you're hundreds of miles from your real home and the people who love you. That's why what happened to me last year was so disturbing, because something invaded that safe space. And I've never felt quite secure in my sleeper cab since. I was on a long haul from Seattle to Miami, pulling a load of computer equipment. A 3-day run with mandatory rest stops, which meant I'd be spending 2 nights sleeping in the truck. Nothing unusual about that. I'd done thousands of similar runs over my 15-year career. The first night went fine. Pulled into a truck stop outside Denver, grabbed dinner at the diner, took a shower, and settled into my sleeper around 10 o'clock. Slept like a baby for 8 hours straight, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes from honest work and a clear conscience. The second night was different, and not in a good way. I'd stopped at a smaller truck stop in eastern Kansas, one of those family-owned places that's been serving drivers for decades. Good food, clean showers, fair prices, the kind of place that makes you feel welcome. even when you're just passing through, like a ghost in the night. Around 11 in the evening, I climbed into my sleeper cab and pulled the curtain closed. I had an early start plan for the next morning, so I wanted to get as much rest as possible. The truck stop was quiet, just a few other rigs parked nearby, and I felt relaxed as I settled into my bunk. That's when I noticed the mirror acting strange. Now, I've got a small mirror mounted on the wall of my sleeper cab, nothing fancy, just a 6-inch square of glass so I can see myself when I'm getting dressed in the morning. I'd had it for years, installed it myself when I first bought the truck. But that night, the reflection looked wrong in ways I couldn't immediately explain. I was lying on my side facing the mirror, and I could see myself clearly enough. But there was something else in the reflection, a shadow that didn't match anything in the actual sleeper cab. It was standing behind me just at the edge of the mirror's range, like someone was crouched in the corner of the sleeper. I turned around to look, but there was nothing there. Just my bags, my spare clothes hanging from a hook, and the usual clutter of life on the road. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, darker and more defined than before. I sat up and turned on the dome light, flooding the sleeper cab with harsh fluorescent illumination. The space was empty except for me, but in the mirror, I could still see that dark shape lurking just behind my reflection. It was tall, human-shaped, but somehow wrong. The proportions weren't quite right, like someone had stretched a person's shadow until it was too long and too thin. I reached out and touched the mirror, wondering if maybe there was something on the surface that was causing the strange reflection. But the glass was clean, and my finger made contact exactly where it should have. That's when the shadow in the mirror moved. It didn't move the way a normal reflection would move, shifting in response to my movements. It shifted independently, leaning forward like it was trying to get a better look at me, studying me with the intensity of a predator watching prey. I jerked my hand back and stared at the mirror, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake up drivers in other trucks. The shadow waved at me, not a friendly wave, but something slow and deliberate, like it was mocking me, or maybe trying to communicate in a language I didn't understand. I scrambled out of my bunk and yanked the mirror off the wall, turning it face down on my small table. But I could still feel something watching me, and when I glanced at the blackened windows of my sleeper cab, I saw the reflection of that same shadow in the glass, following my movements with unnatural precision. I threw on my clothes and climbed out of the truck, thinking maybe I just needed some fresh air and a cup of coffee to clear my head. The truck stop diner was still open, so I sat at the counter and tried to make sense of what I'd seen, wondering if fatigue and stress were finally getting to me. Story 8. The moving rest stop. Some things about trucking never change, no matter how many years you spend on the road. The weight of a full load pulling at your truck, the sound of diesel engines harmonizing on the highway, the way your back aches after 12 hours behind the wheel. And rest stops. They're always exactly where you expect them to be, marked on every map, GPS coordinates programmed into your navigation system with military precision. That's why what happened to me last spring still doesn't make sense, because I found a rest stop that shouldn't exist in a place where it had never been before, and when I woke up the next morning, everything had changed in ways that challenged my understanding of reality itself. I was running a load of textiles from Charlotte to Phoenix, taking Interstate 40 west through Tennessee and Arkansas. It was a familiar route, one I'd driven dozens of times over the past 5 years. I knew every truck stop, every way station, every place to grab a decent meal or take a shower, every mile marker like old friends along a well-traveled path. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere in eastern Arkansas, I started getting drowsy. I'd been driving for 10 hours straight, and the coffee wasn't cutting it anymore. I needed to find a place to park and catch a few hours of sleep before I became a danger to myself and other drivers sharing the dark highway. But I was in a stretch of road that didn't have any official rest areas for another 50 miles, just dark farmland on both sides, with maybe a gas station every 20 miles or so. I was starting to think I'd have to pull over on the shoulder when I saw a sign in my headlights that didn't belong there. Rest area 2 miles. I'd never seen that sign before, but I was too tired to question it. Maybe the state had built a new facility since my last run through Arkansas. Wouldn't be the first time a rest stop had appeared, seemingly overnight. Bureaucracy and construction moving in mysterious ways. 2 miles later, I saw the entrance ramp. Standard Department of Transportation design with concrete barriers, regulation signage, and solar-powered lights illuminating the way like a beacon for weary travelers. I pulled in and found a decent-sized parking area with spaces for maybe 20 trucks, clean and well-maintained. The place was completely empty, which wasn't unusual for 2 in the morning on a Tuesday night. I parked near the restroom building and walked over to check it out. Clean facilities, working lights, everything you'd expect from a modern rest area. There was even a vending machine humming quietly in the corner, offering snacks and drinks to late-night travelers. I went back to my truck and climbed into the sleeper cab, set my alarm for 6 in the morning and was asleep within minutes. But when I woke up, something felt profoundly wrong. The light coming through my curtains was all wrong. Too dim, too gray, like dawn was having trouble breaking through heavy clouds that weren't there the night before. When I checked my phone, it showed 6 o'clock exactly, but the quality of light suggested something else entirely. I climbed out of my cab and looked around, feeling like I'd awakened in a different world. The rest stop looked the same as it had the night before, but the trees surrounding it seemed different somehow. Taller, more dense, like they'd grown 20 years overnight. And there was no sound of highway traffic, no distant rumble of engines that should have been constant on a major interstate. I walked over to where the entrance ramp should have been, and that's when I realized what was wrong. There was no ramp, no highway, just a narrow gravel road that wound away through the trees and disappeared into the morning mist like something from a fairy tale. My truck was still parked exactly where I'd left it, but the rest stop had somehow moved, or maybe I had moved, or maybe the whole world had shifted while I was sleeping. I tried starting my engine, thinking maybe I could follow the gravel road back to civilization, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over, like the battery was completely dead. That's when I noticed the other truck parked on the far side of the rest area, an old Peterbilt that looked like it had been there for years. Rust stains ran down its sides like tears of metal, and weeds were growing up around the tires. The windshield was so dirty I couldn't see inside the cab, and the whole rig had an abandoned quality that made my skin crawl. I walked over and knocked on the driver's door, half expecting no answer. After a moment, it creaked open, and an old man climbed down from the cab. He was maybe 70 with wild gray hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. But his eyes were kind and alert. "Morning," he said, like it was perfectly normal to meet another trucker in the middle of nowhere. "Name's Earl. You just get here last night?" I nodded, still trying to process what was happening. "Yeah, but this place, it wasn't here before, and now there's no highway." Earl nodded like that made perfect sense, like he'd had this conversation many times before. Happens sometimes. Rest stop moves around, takes people with it. I've been here, must be going on 3 years now? The casual way he said it, like being trapped in a supernatural rest stop was just another inconvenience of life on the road, made everything seem even more surreal. 3 years? I asked, feeling the weight of that number. Earl scratched his beard thoughtfully. Time works different here. Could be 3 years, could be 3 days. Hard to tell when the sun never seems to get above the trees, when every moment feels like the same eternal dawn. Story 9. The fuel stop encounter. There's an unwritten rule in trucking about fueling up in the middle of the night at unfamiliar truck stops. You keep your head down, mind your own business, and get back on the road as quickly as possible, because that's when you meet the people who only come out in the dark. The ones who have nowhere else to be and nothing better to do than bother drivers who are just trying to make a living and get home safely to their family. I learned that rule the hard way 2 years ago on a run through western Texas. I was hauling machine parts from Houston to Albuquerque, running behind schedule because of construction delays on Interstate 10 that had turned the highway into a parking lot for hours at a time. By the time I hit the stretch of road between San Antonio and El Paso, I was looking at driving straight through the night to make my delivery window. Around 3 in the morning, my fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and in that part of Texas, truck stops can be few and far between. The landscape stretches out forever in all directions, nothing but desert and sagebrush and the occasional oil derrick pumping black gold from deep underground. So when I saw the neon signs of a pilot station ahead, glowing like a mirage in the darkness, I pulled in without hesitation. The place was nearly deserted, just my truck and maybe 2 others parked near the back of the lot, where the shadows were deepest. The convenience store was brightly lit, but looked empty except for a clerk behind the counter who was probably counting the minutes until his shift ended and he could go home to his warm bed. I pulled up to the diesel pumps and started the fueling process. The same routine I'd done thousands of times before without giving it a second thought. Insert my fuel card, select the grade, start pumping, watch the numbers climb on the display while I stretched my legs and breathed the cool desert air. That's when I noticed the man watching me from across the pump island. He was standing next to pump number 6, but there was no truck near him, just an empty concrete pad where a vehicle should have been. He was maybe 50 years old, wearing dirty work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Nothing particularly unusual about his appearance except for the way he was staring at me. There was an intensity in his gaze that made my skin crawl, like he was studying me for reasons I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore him and focus on fueling my truck, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, watching my every movement with predatory interest. When I glanced over, he was still there, still staring, still standing next to that empty pump like he was waiting for a truck that would never come. My tank was about half full when he started walking toward me, moving with the deliberate gait of someone who had all the time in the world. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly like he'd been smoking unfiltered cigarettes for decades. "Nice rig you got there." I kept my eyes on the fuel pump, not wanting to encourage conversation. "Thanks," I replied tersely, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. "You heading west?" he asked, stepping closer. That's when I caught a whiff of something unpleasant. Not just body odor, but something else. Something that reminded me of roadkill that had been sitting in the Texas sun too long. "That's right," I said, still not making eye contact. "Mind if I ask what you're hauling?" Now that was a question that raised red flags throughout my entire nervous system. Legitimate truckers might ask about your destination or your company, but cargo details were usually kept private for security reasons. Anyone asking about my load was either new to the business or had ulterior motives I didn't want to explore. "Just machinery," I said vaguely, hoping the fuel pump would click off soon so I could get back on the road and away from this increasingly uncomfortable conversation. He stepped even closer, and I could see that his face was pale in the fluorescent lighting, and there was something wrong with his eyes. They didn't reflect the light the way they should have, like looking into deep, dark holes. "I used to haul machinery," he said with a tone that suggested he was just getting started. "Drove for Peterson Manufacturing out of Dallas for 15 years. Good company, good benefits, until I had my accident." The fuel pump clicked off with a mechanical finality, indicating my tank was full. I started to replace the nozzle, eager to get back on the road and away from this strange encounter. "Sorry to hear that," I said, trying to sound sympathetic while moving toward my cab. "Must have been rough." He followed me, his boots crunching on the asphalt like breaking bones. "Oh, it was more than rough," he said with a smile that didn't reach those dead eyes. "It was fatal." Story 10. The Government Cargo. After 20 years of driving truck, you think you've hauled every kind of cargo imaginable. Electronics and food products, raw materials, and manufactured goods, livestock, and hazardous chemicals that require special permits and careful handling. If it needs to get from point A to point B, chances are a trucker has moved it at some point in the great dance of commerce that keeps America running. But there's one load I hauled 2 years ago that still gives me nightmares, because I never found out what was really in that trailer, and I'm not sure I want to know. Sometimes ignorance isn't just bliss, it's survival, and some secrets are too dangerous for ordinary people to carry. I got the call on a Tuesday morning from a broker I'd worked with before, someone who usually dealt with legitimate freight and honest paperwork. High priority shipment, excellent pay, but the details were vague in ways that should have been warning signs. Specialized equipment from a research facility in Montana to a government installation in Nevada, they said. The shipper would provide all the necessary paperwork, and I'd be escorted by federal agents for the entire journey. The pay was too good to pass up, even though something about the job felt off from the very beginning, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together properly. I picked up my escort at a truck stop outside Billings, 2 men in black SUVs who looked like they'd stepped out of a government manual. Dark suits despite the summer heat, sunglasses that hid their eyes, and the kind of serious expressions that discouraged small talk or unnecessary questions. They introduced themselves as Agent Miller and Agent Johnson, which were probably about as real as their claim that they were with the Department of Agriculture. The loading facility was 30 miles outside town, down a series of increasingly remote dirt roads that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. It was surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire, and there were more guards than you'd expect for a legitimate research operation. Whatever they were studying in there, they didn't want uninvited guests. And they certainly didn't want anyone asking uncomfortable questions about their work. The loading dock was inside a warehouse with no windows, and fluorescent lights that hummed with an electrical buzz that made my teeth ache. A forklift brought out a single crate, maybe 8 feet long, 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. Heavy-gauge steel construction with air holes drilled in the sides and warning labels I couldn't read from a distance. "What exactly am I hauling?" I asked Agent Miller as they loaded the crate into my trailer with mechanical efficiency. "Biological specimens," he said without looking at me, like he'd rehearsed the answer. "Nothing dangerous, but they require climate-controlled transport and minimal disturbance." The crate was secured with extra straps and chains, more than seemed necessary for its size and weight. But what really bothered me were the air holes. If this was just preserved specimens or research samples, why would they need ventilation? Dead things don't need to breathe, and the implications of that thought made my stomach churn. We hit the road around noon, my truck sandwiched between the 2 government SUVs like filling in a very official sandwich. The agents had given me a route that avoided major highways and population centers, adding maybe 6 hours to what should have been a 12-hour drive. They clearly didn't want anyone to see what we were transporting. For the first few hours, everything went normally. The crate was silent, my truck was running well, and the agents maintained radio contact to coordinate rest stops and fuel breaks. But around sunset, as we were crossing into Utah, I started hearing sounds from my trailer that made me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of the cargo. At first it was just scratching, like an animal trying to dig its way out of a box, which made sense if they were transporting some kind of research animal. But the scratching was too rhythmic, too deliberate, almost like Morse code, tapped out by someone who knew exactly what they were trying to communicate. I radioed Agent Miller with growing concern. "I'm getting some noise from the cargo. Is that normal?" "Perfectly normal," he replied without hesitation. "Just minor settling during transport. Ignore it and maintain speed." But the scratching continued, and after another hour, it was joined by other sounds that were definitely not normal. Tapping, rattling, and something that sounded disturbingly like whimpering, like a frightened child crying for help. The sounds grew more desperate as the night wore on, and I found myself wondering what kind of biological specimens would make noises like that, and whether I really wanted to know the answer. Story 11. The Time Loop Highway. There are some roads that every trucker knows to avoid if possible. Routes through mountain passes in winter, where ice and snow can turn your rig into a several-ton sledge with no brakes. Highways that cut through Tornado Alley during storm season when the sky turns green and the wind starts making sounds that don't belong in nature. Stretches of desert road where breakdowns can turn deadly under the merciless sun. But there's one route that most drivers won't even talk about. A section of Interstate 80 through Nevada that old-timers call the Graveyard. I learned why they call it that 3 years ago on what should have been a routine run from Reno to Salt Lake City. A journey that turned into something that challenged my understanding of time, space, and the nature of reality itself. It was late October and I was hauling a load of casino equipment, running night shift to avoid the heavy tourist traffic during the day. The weather was perfect, clear skies stretching from horizon to horizon, no wind, temperature in the 60s. The kind of night that makes you love being a trucker, when the highway stretches out before you like a ribbon of possibility. Around midnight, I was making good time through the Nevada desert when I noticed headlights in my mirrors. Nothing unusual about that. Other truckers run the same routes, same schedules, sharing the loneliness of the night highway. But these lights stayed exactly the same distance behind me for miles, never getting closer, never falling back, maintaining perfect synchronization with my rig. I tried slowing down to let them pass, but they slowed down too. Sped up and they matched my speed perfectly, like we were connected by some invisible tether. After about 20 minutes of this strange dance, I grabbed my CB mic, hoping to make contact with whoever was behind me. Breaker 19, this is Reno Runner to the driver behind me on eastbound 80. You got your ears on back there? Nothing but static answered me, the kind of white noise that makes the night feel even more isolated. I tried again, keying the mic with growing frustration. Come on back, driver. Just wondering if you need to get around me or if there's a problem with my rig. Still nothing, just that empty static that seemed to swallow my words before they could reach their intended destination. I checked my mirrors again and the headlights were still there, maintaining that same perfect distance. But now I noticed something strange about them. They looked old. Not the bright white LED lights that most modern trucks use, but the yellowish glow of older halogen bulbs, the kind you don't see much anymore on the highway. That's when I saw the second set of headlights appear out of nowhere in my passenger side mirror, running parallel to me in the passing lane. But when I looked out my window, there was nothing there, just empty highway stretching out into the desert darkness like a black ocean under the star-filled sky. A third set of lights appeared behind the first truck, then a fourth, then a fifth. Within minutes, I was looking at a full convoy of ghost trucks in my mirrors, maybe 8 or 10 rigs running in perfect formation, their headlights casting no light on the actual highway, existing only in the reflection of my mirrors. I keyed my CB again, my voice shaking this time with a mixture of fear and confusion. Breaker 19, this is Reno Runner. I've got multiple trucks showing up in my mirrors, but I can't see them on the actual road. Anybody else seeing this? Voice crackled back through the static, old and tired, speaking with an accent I couldn't place but that carried the weight of decades on the road. Evening, Reno Runner. This is Lead Dog. We've been waiting for you. The casual familiarity in his voice, like we were old friends meeting at a truck stop, instead of strangers encountering each other in some supernatural highway phenomenon, made the whole situation even more surreal. Waiting for me? I asked, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. I don't understand. You're running our route, son, Lead Dog replied with something that might have been sadness in his voice. The route we've been running for 30 years. We just wanted to welcome you to the convoy. let you know you're not alone out here in the darkness. Story 12. The Hidden Passage. When I was 10 years old, our family lived in a house that had been passed down through 3 generations, nestled deep within a wooded area where ancient trees formed natural barriers on 3 sides. My bedroom occupied the back corner of the house, with windows facing the forest on 2 walls, creating an atmosphere that felt both magical and slightly unsettling for a child my age. The room itself was quite spacious, filled with the usual childhood treasures and toys that made it feel like my own private kingdom during daylight hours. I had always been a heavy sleeper, rarely troubled by nightmares or sleep disturbances, which made the events that began unfolding all the more puzzling. It started with my nightlight, a small device with multiple color settings that I kept positioned near my bed. I had developed a particular fondness for the red setting, finding its warm glow comforting as I drifted off to sleep each night. The gentle crimson light became part of my bedtime routine, as reliable as brushing my teeth or saying goodnight to my parents. One morning, however, I awakened to discover that my nightlight was glowing blue instead of its usual red. The change seemed odd, but not particularly alarming at first. When I mentioned it to my parents over breakfast, they suggested that the device might be experiencing some technical difficulties, explaining that electronic items sometimes developed quirks over time. Their casual dismissal seemed reasonable, and I accepted their explanation without much concern. But the mysterious color changes continued to occur, becoming more frequent and noticeable over the following weeks. Sometimes I would wake to find the light purple, other times green or yellow. Each morning brought a new surprise, and each time my parents maintained their theory about mechanical malfunctions. However, their explanations began to feel less convincing when I discovered the nightlight completely unplugged one morning, sitting innocently on the floor beside its outlet. This particular incident sparked a heated discussion with my parents, who continued to insist that they had no involvement in these strange occurrences. They suggested that perhaps I was sleepwalking, or that the electrical connections were loose, causing the device to fall. But their reasoning felt hollow, especially when my nightlight disappeared entirely a few days later. Despite extensive searching throughout my room and questioning my parents repeatedly, the little device had simply vanished without explanation. The tension in our household grew as I became increasingly convinced that my parents were hiding something from me, while they seemed genuinely puzzled by my accusations. This standoff continued for about a week before new developments began to unfold. I started awakening randomly during the night, something that had never happened before in my young life. Each time I stirred from sleep, I felt alert and confused, unable to identify what had disturbed my rest. After several nights of these mysterious awakenings, I decided to remain conscious instead of immediately returning to sleep. During one of these vigils, I detected faint rustling sounds emanating from my closet area. The noises were subtle but distinct, like fabric brushing against fabric or small objects being carefully moved around. When I reported these sounds to my parents the next morning, they responded with the same patient skepticism they had shown regarding the nightlight incidents. My father even conducted a thorough inspection of the closet, moving aside old toys and rolled posters to demonstrate that nothing unusual was present. His search seemed comprehensive and reassuring, yet the nocturnal sounds continued to occur with disturbing regularity. Night after night, I would awaken to those same mysterious rustling noises, always seeming to originate from the same area of my closet. The situation reached its frightening climax when my father, frustrated by my persistent claims and perhaps beginning to doubt his own explanations, decided to conduct a more aggressive investigation. He entered my room with determination, pulling items from the closet with increasing intensity, while insisting that I needed to stop imagining things. His methodical removal of toys and games gradually revealed the back wall of the closet, where several old posters had been hanging for years. When he peeled away one of these posters, both of my parents fell silent in shock. Behind the innocent-looking decoration was a hole in the wall, clearly artificial and large enough for a person to crawl through. The opening was much deeper than anyone could have expected, disappearing into darkness that our flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. My mother began making distress sounds while my father immediately went outside to investigate the exterior of our house. His outdoor examination revealed a small opening near the foundation, partially concealed by dirt and vegetation. Further digging exposed what appeared to be a tunnel system that connected the woods directly to my bedroom. The discovery explained everything: the nightlight changes, the nocturnal sounds, and, most disturbing of all, the presence of an unknown person who had been entering my room regularly for over a month. We packed our belongings and left that house immediately, staying with relatives until my parents could arrange alternative accommodations. The knowledge that someone had been sharing my sleeping space for weeks, watching me while I slept and moving around my personal belongings, created a sense of violation that affected our entire family. To this day, my parents prefer not to discuss the incident, perhaps carrying guilt about initially dismissing my concerns as childhood imagination. Story 13, The Midnight Swimmer. During my 21st summer, I found myself spending long stretches alone at my family's house, a beautiful property situated directly beside a small pond that served as our backyard's main feature. Across the water lay a quaint town park, and our neighbors maintained respectful distances on their own spacious lots, creating an atmosphere of peaceful isolation that I had grown to appreciate. My parents owned multiple residences and traveled frequently for business, leaving me to enjoy the tranquility of our upscale neighborhood while completing my college studies. On this particular evening, the summer air was warm and inviting, perfect for relaxing in our sunroom with all the windows open to catch the gentle breeze. This glass-enclosed space had always been my favorite retreat during the warmer months, offering an ideal combination of indoor comfort and outdoor connection. I had settled into the corner of our comfortable couch, positioned near the window that provided the best view of the pond, and was enjoying a television program when the first unusual sounds reached my ears. Initially, the splashing noises from outside seemed perfectly normal for a summer evening. Our pond occasionally hosted visiting waterfowl, and territorial disputes between geese or ducks could create quite a commotion in the water. These natural sounds had become part of the ambient soundtrack of our peaceful property, so I paid little attention at first. However, as the splashing continued and seemed to intensify, I found myself becoming more curious about its source. I lowered the television volume to better assess what was happening outside, then pressed my ear closer to the screen to determine whether these sounds matched the typical patterns of bird activity. The splashing seemed too heavy and consistent for waterfowl, lacking the erratic nature of animals fighting or feeding. Instead, the rhythm suggested something larger and more deliberate, moving through the water with purposeful strokes. Growing more intrigued, I decided to step outside onto our deck to investigate further. The summer night had settled into complete darkness, making it impossible to see much beyond the immediate vicinity of our house. As I stood listening in the warm air, the mystery deepened considerably when I detected the sound of human humming accompanying the water movements. Someone was definitely swimming in our pond, trespassing on property that was clearly divided among the homeowners who surrounded the water. Uncertain whether this might be one of our neighbors taking an unusual evening swim, I stepped back inside temporarily to turn on our deck lighting system. The illumination revealed only a small portion of the pond's surface, but it was enough to make the swimming sounds and humming stop abruptly. Whoever was in the water had clearly noticed my presence and was now aware that they had been discovered. Rather than confronting an unknown person in the darkness, I decided that discretion was the wiser course of action. I retreated inside, making sure to lock the door securely behind me, and sent a text message to my brother describing the unusual situation. While waiting for his response, I attempted to return my attention to the television program, but concentration proved impossible given the circumstances. The knowledge that someone had been swimming so close to our house, combined with their immediate reaction to being spotted, created an atmosphere of unease that made relaxation difficult. I kept glancing toward the windows, but the darkness outside revealed nothing useful. The television continued playing in the background, though I hadn't considered how its glow might be visible from outside, essentially advertising my presence and location within the house. My contemplation was interrupted by what sounded like footsteps on our deck, causing me to quickly locate the remote control and eliminate the television's revealing light. As the room plunged into darkness and silence, I remained motionless on the couch, allowing my eyes to adjust while straining to identify any additional sounds. After several moments, I became aware of heavy breathing just outside one of the sunroom's many windows. The realization that someone was standing so close to where I sat sent chills through my entire body. I immediately dropped flat against the couch cushions, hoping to remain hidden from view, and tried to control my own breathing while listening intently. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, a deep male voice spoke clearly from just outside the glass, saying simply, "I see you." Panic flooded through me as I struggled to decide whether to respond or maintain my hiding position. In my frightened state, I called out the name of one of our neighbors, desperately hoping that this might be some sort of misguided prank or misunderstanding. But no response came to my hopeful inquiry, only the sound of bare feet moving away from the house, gradually fading into the distance. I remained frozen on the couch for several more minutes before finally gathering the courage to check that all our doors were properly secured. Both the front entrance and side door were locked, providing some measure of comfort, though the experience had left me thoroughly shaken. I contacted my family members to report the incident, and my father instructed me to turn on all the exterior lighting and investigate whether anyone was still lurking around our property. Armed with a kitchen knife for protection, I cautiously ventured back onto the deck to survey the area. The lighting revealed wet footprints on the wooden surface, clearly showing the path of someone who had been walking barefoot around our house. Following this trail led me to the most disturbing discovery of all: a person's head partially visible over the edge of our deck, watching me from below with an intensity that suggested they had been waiting for my appearance. Our eyes met for just a moment before the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, prompting me to immediately call emergency services while retreating to the safety of our locked house. Story 14. The Haunted Toy Car. In the old house where my family lived on Long Island, my older brother Luke and I shared a large bedroom on the upper floor that had once served as a separate apartment. This spacious room had been converted from the previous tenant's living area, providing us with ample space for all our childhood treasures and countless toys. The room featured 2 parallel walk-in closets on opposite walls, perfect for storing our extensive collection of games, sports equipment, and various playthings that had accumulated over the years. Among all our possessions, one toy held particular significance: a battery-operated race car adorned with multiple buttons that controlled various sound effects and lighting features. This remarkable toy could produce realistic engine revving sounds, honking horns, driving noises, and even played a cheerful little rock song when activated. The car had been with our family for years, originally given to Luke when he was much younger, and had become a beloved fixture in our room, despite its age. The first supernatural incident occurred on an ordinary evening, when Luke and I were both settling into our beds, not yet asleep but growing drowsy in the comfortable darkness of our room. Without any warning or apparent cause, the race car suddenly roared to life in the middle of the floor, its lights flashing brilliantly while the loud revving sound effect filled the previously quiet space. The unexpected activation startled me considerably, and I immediately accused Luke of deliberately triggering the toy to frighten me. Luke responded with genuine laughter, insisting that he hadn't touched the car and was just as surprised by its spontaneous operation as I was. His reaction seemed authentic, but I remained suspicious, convinced that he must have somehow activated the toy remotely or through some method I couldn't detect. Despite my accusations, the car eventually quieted down, returning to its normal inactive state while we both tried to process what had happened. Time passed peacefully after this initial incident, and eventually I managed to fall asleep despite my lingering unease about the mysterious toy activation. Several weeks went by without any similar occurrences, allowing me to gradually forget about the strange event and return to normal childhood routines. However, the supernatural activity was far from finished, as we would soon discover during another nighttime encounter. On the second occasion, Luke and I were again preparing for sleep when we both heard an unexplained thudding sound somewhere within our room. The noise was distinct and purposeful, clearly not the result of normal settling sounds or exterior activity. Luke, perhaps trying to maintain his role as the older brother, began making jokes about ghosts haunting our room, suggesting playfully that supernatural forces might be responsible for the mysterious sounds. His teasing made me increasingly anxious, and I threatened to call our mother if he didn't stop trying to scare me with talk of paranormal activity. But our conversation was interrupted when we both noticed a light emanating from the corner of our room, where the race car typically sat. Once again, the toy had activated itself without any human intervention, its colorful lights creating an eerie glow in the darkness while remaining completely silent this time. This second incident proved too frightening for me to handle, and I immediately ran downstairs to seek comfort and protection from our parents. I burst into their bedroom, breathlessly explaining that something supernatural was happening in our room and that the toy car was operating by itself. My parents listened to my excited 7-year-old explanation with the patient skepticism that adults typically show toward children's ghost stories. When Luke eventually joined us in our parents' room, my mother assumed that he had been deliberately scaring me and told him to stop his pranks immediately. But Luke maintained his innocence, reasonably pointing out that he couldn't possibly control the car's lights from across the room while lying in his bed. The logic of his argument seemed to give our parents pause, though they didn't immediately embrace supernatural explanations for the events. I ended up sleeping in my parents' room that night, too frightened to return upstairs despite their gentle encouragement. The security of their presence helped me rest peacefully, though questions about the toy car's mysterious behavior continued to trouble my thoughts. Several weeks passed quietly after this incident, allowing normal family life to resume without further supernatural interruptions. The most dramatic encounter occurred when Luke was spending the night at a friend's house, leaving me alone in our large bedroom for the first time since the strange incidents had begun. I had specifically asked our mother to leave the bedroom door open, knowing that the empty room would feel more intimidating without my brother's presence. Despite her reassuring goodnight kiss and promise to check on me later, I found myself wide awake and anxious as bedtime approached. I had taken the precaution of moving the troublesome race car out of our bedroom entirely, storing it in the small extra bedroom across the hallway where it couldn't disturb my sleep. This seemed like a sensible solution that would prevent any further supernatural activations while allowing me to rest peacefully. However, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard unexplained sounds coming from somewhere down the hall. Turning to face the open doorway, I witnessed something that would haunt my childhood memories forever. The race car slowly rolled into our bedroom under its own power, its lights blazing brightly in the darkness as it moved with deliberate purpose across the floor. No one was pushing or controlling the toy, yet it navigated the hallway and entered our room as if guided by an invisible hand. The sight of this impossible occurrence triggered a scream that seemed to come from the very depths of my being, expressing terror beyond anything I had previously experienced. My parents rushed upstairs immediately, finding me pressed against the wall in absolute panic, while the mysteriously mobile toy sat innocently on our bedroom floor. My father conducted a thorough search of the entire upper level, checking every possible hiding place, but found no explanation for how the car had moved from one room to another. My father ultimately decided to destroy the haunted toy completely, smashing it thoroughly before disposing of the pieces in a neighbor's trash can to ensure it could never return to disturb our peace again. Story 15. The Stalker's Notes. The small house I rented in my new town represented a significant milestone in my life, marking my first real independence after landing my first serious job. It was a modest one-story home with 2 bedrooms, a single bathroom, and just enough living space to accommodate my simple lifestyle and occasional guests. The property belonged to a woman I'll call Michelle, who had proven to be an exceptionally understanding and accommodating landlord during the rental process. Michelle had mentioned during our initial meeting that she preferred renting to female tenants, explaining that she felt more comfortable with women occupying her property. This preference seemed reasonable and even reassuring to me, suggesting that she was concerned about maintaining a safe and respectful living environment. The house itself felt perfect for my needs, offering the privacy and comfort I desired while remaining affordable on my modest starting salary. After settling into my new home for several peaceful weeks, I had established comfortable routines and begun to feel truly at home in my surroundings. The neighborhood seemed quiet and safe, with friendly neighbors who respected appropriate boundaries while remaining available if assistance was needed. Everything about my new living situation felt positive and promising, making the events that followed all the more disturbing and unexpected. The first sign of trouble came on an ordinary weeknight when I was relaxing at home after a typical day at the office. A sharp knock at my front door interrupted my evening routine, causing me to approach cautiously since I wasn't expecting any visitors. When I called out to ask who was there, no response came from the other side of the door. The silence felt ominous, and I decided that the safest course of action was to remain inside rather than open the door to investigate. The following morning, as I prepared to leave for work, I discovered a note taped to my storm door that immediately made my stomach clench with unease. The message was brief but deeply unsettling, containing only the words, "Hello, beautiful," written in unfamiliar handwriting. The realization that someone had been at my door late at night, then returned to leave this message, created a sense of violation that stayed with me throughout the workday. I disposed of the note immediately, hoping fervently that this would prove to be an isolated incident rather than the beginning of a pattern. However, my optimistic assumption was shattered when the knocking occurred again the following evening, this time while I was preparing dinner in my kitchen. I approached the door silently, choosing not to announce my presence while listening for any sounds that might identify my mysterious visitor. Without a peephole or window near the entrance, I had no way to see who was outside without actually opening the door, which seemed unwise given the circumstances. The lack of visibility options made me feel particularly vulnerable, especially since my storm door didn't have a functional lock to provide an additional barrier. When I contacted my parents for advice about this escalating situation, they offered practical guidance based on my father's background in law enforcement. My father explained that police intervention would be difficult to obtain unless the stalker was caught in the act of harassing me, since notes and knocking didn't constitute clear evidence of criminal activity. He advised me to avoid going outside alone after dark, to never answer the door for unexpected visitors, and to call him immediately if the harassment continued. His suggestion that he would come stay with me for several days if necessary provided some comfort during this increasingly stressful time. The next morning brought another note, this one more explicit and threatening than the first. The message read, "I like to watch you," confirming my worst fears that someone was not only leaving unwanted messages, but also observing my daily activities. I immediately photographed this note and sent copies to both my family and Michelle, hoping that my landlord might have insights about potential suspects or previous problems with the property. Michelle's response seemed genuine in its surprise and concern, insisting that she had never experienced stalking issues and was currently in a stable long-term relationship that ruled her out as a target. However, her assurances didn't eliminate the possibility that someone might be seeking her specifically, mistaking me for the property owner. I decided to leave my own note on the door, explaining that Michelle no longer lived there and threatening police involvement if the harassment continued. This strategy initially seemed successful, as that evening passed without any knocking or additional disturbances. I allowed myself to hope that my message had resolved the situation by clarifying the misunderstanding about Michelle's residence. However, the next morning revealed how naive this assumption had been, as a new note waited on my door with a message that made my blood run cold. The latest communication made it clear that the stalker knew exactly who I was, including my name, and wasn't looking for Michelle at all. The note explicitly stated, "I'm not looking for Michelle, I'm looking for you," followed by my actual name and the same threatening message about watching me. This revelation that my stalker knew my identity suggested either someone from my workplace or a person who had access to personal information about my living situation. I contacted my father immediately, and he drove up that same day to provide support and help coordinate with local police. The responding officer took our report seriously, though my father noted that they had only sent one patrol car, despite the clear stalking pattern we had documented. Having a retired police officer involved in the situation definitely helped ensure that our concerns were treated with appropriate gravity and professionalism. We strategically timed the police visit for the evening hours, when the stalker typically appeared, hoping that visible law enforcement presence might deter future incidents or potentially catch the perpetrator in the act. My father spent several additional hours stationed outside the house after the officer left, maintaining a protective vigil that ensured the stalker wouldn't return that night. The combination of police involvement and my father's presence proved effective, as no further incidents occurred during his visit or in the days that followed. I was able to arrange a move to a different rental property within a reasonable time frame, and Michelle was completely understanding about the early termination of my lease, given the circumstances. Most importantly, the stalking behavior didn't follow me to my new address, suggesting that the harassment had been location-specific rather than personally targeted. Story 16. The College Trap. During my sophomore year at a California university, I had recently completed the pledging process for my fraternity and was eager to expand my social circle beyond the somewhat insular Greek life community. The campus culture was notably open and casual about relationships, which initially seemed exciting, but gradually began to feel repetitive and limiting. I found myself growing tired of the predictable social dynamics within fraternity and sorority circles, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's romantic history. Thinking to meet new people outside my usual social sphere, I decided to create a profile on a popular dating application. The anonymity and broader reach of online dating appealed to me as a way to connect with students who weren't part of the Greek system. Within a relatively short time, I matched with someone whose interests and conversation style seemed compatible with my own personality and preferences. After several days of engaging text conversations, we arranged to meet at a local establishment called Tap House, which was one of my favorite venues in the area. The bar featured several pool tables, and I had been playing billiards since childhood, making this location an ideal choice for a relaxed first meeting. I arrived early to secure a table and practice a few games while waiting for my date to arrive. An hour passed without any sign of my expected companion, and I began to accept the disappointing reality that I had likely been stood up. I was debating whether to salvage the evening by staying to play pool alone, or simply return to my dormitory to spend time on other activities, when my phone finally provided an explanation. A message from my date apologized for the delay and indicated that she had just arrived at the venue. The evening proceeded pleasantly as we enjoyed drinks, played several games of pool, and engaged in the typical getting-to-know-you conversations that characterize first dates. She was Latina, attractive, and matched my drinking pace with impressive stamina, leading me to consume more alcohol than I normally would. The combination of beer and competitive pool playing created a relaxed atmosphere that made the time pass quickly and enjoyably. At some point during the evening, she asked for my social media contact information, which I provided without hesitation. Almost immediately after sharing this information, she sent me several explicit photographs through the messaging application. While surprised by this sudden escalation, my intoxicated state prevented me from questioning the appropriateness or wisdom of this exchange. especially given our physical proximity. She then requested similar images from me, which I interpreted as a natural progression of our digital flirtation. In retrospect, the alcohol had clearly impaired my judgment significantly, as I would normally have questioned the logic of exchanging intimate photographs with someone sitting just a few feet away. However, at the time, this behavior seemed like harmless fun between two consenting adults. As the evening continued and the bar began to wind down, I was preparing to invite her to continue our interaction at my apartment when she surprised me by suggesting that I spend the night at her place instead. This invitation seemed like a positive development, and I readily agreed to accompany her to her residence, despite my increasingly intoxicated condition. We traveled by rideshare service to what I assumed was her apartment, though I wasn't paying careful attention to our route or destination due to my impaired state. I noticed vaguely that we seemed to be traveling into Oakland, which struck me as somewhat unusual, but didn't trigger any serious concerns at the time. My judgment was clearly compromised by alcohol consumption, preventing me from recognizing potential warning signs. On arriving at the destination, she unlocked the door and gestured for me to enter first, which seemed like normal courtesy. I stepped into what appeared to be a dark apartment and was turning around to ask her about lighting when the room suddenly illuminated, revealing a scene that sobered me instantly despite my intoxication. Instead of finding myself alone with my date, I discovered 3 large, intimidating men positioned strategically around the room. 2 bald individuals wearing tank tops blocked the exit door, while a third man stood directly in front of me, effectively trapping me in the center of the space. The men appeared to be positioned deliberately, suggesting that this confrontation had been planned in advance. The man facing me began reciting personal information about me, including my full name, birth date, and age, demonstrating that they had researched my background prior to this encounter. He then delivered the devastating news that my date was actually 17 years old, making our earlier exchange of explicit photographs a serious legal violation involving a minor. The implications of this revelation were immediately clear, as possession and distribution of such materials involving underage individuals carries severe legal penalties, regardless of intent or deception. The man explained that they had evidence of these exchanges and would use this information to destroy my reputation and future prospects unless I cooperated with their demands. Their requirements involved using my fraternity connections and university access to distribute illegal substances throughout the campus community. They made it clear that refusal would result in my exposure as someone who had engaged in inappropriate contact with a minor, effectively ending my educational and professional prospects before they had truly begun. The 2 men behind me confiscated my phone, wallet, and keys while their leader handed me paper and demanded that I write down my address along with contact information for as many students as possible. They held my phone nearby while I scrolled through my contacts, allowing them to copy names and numbers while maintaining physical control over the device. In a moment of desperation or clarity, I saw a brief opportunity when their attention seemed divided and made a desperate escape attempt. Despite my intoxication, I managed to break free from the apartment and run as fast as possible through the dangerous Oakland streets, until exhaustion and alcohol nearly caused me to collapse. Eventually, I found a residential area where I convinced someone to allow me to call emergency services and report the incident to police authorities. Story 17: The Phantom Voice. Every day for several years, I had maintained the same routine with my dog, taking him for walks 3 times daily at consistent intervals. Our morning walks started each day with energy and purpose, followed by a relaxing afternoon outing, and concluded with our final evening walk when the neighborhood had settled into peaceful quiet. We always followed the identical route, which led from our driveway through a small parking area that served the condominium complex where we lived. The evening walks had become particularly special to me, though I'm not entirely sure why I preferred these late-night outings to our daytime adventures. Perhaps there was something soothing about the calm atmosphere and reduced activity that made these walks feel more meditative and personal. This routine had never caused any problems or concerns, making the events of one particular night all the more shocking and disturbing. On this evening, I prepared for our usual final walk of the day, gathering my flashlight and putting in one earbud to listen to music while keeping the other ear free to monitor our surroundings. This had become my standard practice for these late walks, providing entertainment while maintaining awareness of any unusual sounds or activities that might require attention. The parking area where we walked had no artificial lighting, making the flashlight essential for navigation and safety. As we approached the parking area, I was enjoying my music and feeling completely relaxed when I began to detect something unusual in the distance ahead of us. There seemed to be a voice of some kind, though initially I was too absorbed in my music and thoughts to pay serious attention to these faint sounds. My mind was wandering, as it often did during these peaceful evening walks, processing the day's events and enjoying the simple pleasure of spending time with my dog. However, something eventually penetrated my distracted state, causing me to stop walking and remove my earbud to listen more carefully. I stood perfectly still, straining to determine whether I had actually heard something unusual or whether my imagination was creating sounds where none existed. After a moment of silence, the voice occurred again, confirming that I wasn't hallucinating, but was actually hearing someone speak in the darkness ahead. The logical part of my mind suggested that I should turn around and return home immediately, but curiosity and concern overrode these sensible instincts. I decided to continue forward cautiously, thinking that perhaps someone needed assistance or that there was a reasonable explanation for voices in the empty parking area. However, as I moved closer to the source of the sounds, my unease began to grow significantly. I stopped again when I reached the area where cars were typically parked during the day, positioning myself near the vehicles while pointing my flashlight in various directions to scan for any signs of human presence. The light revealed nothing unusual or alarming, yet I remained alert and listening for any repetition of the mysterious voice I had detected earlier. What happened next became the most unsettling experience of my entire life. From somewhere in the darkness near the parked cars, I heard what sounded like a child's voice calling for help. The word help was spoken clearly, but with a muffled quality that made it difficult to determine the exact source or distance. My immediate reaction was panic and concern for a child who might be in genuine distress. I frantically swept my flashlight beam across the entire area, desperately searching for any sign of a child or person who might need assistance. The urgency of the situation made my heart race as I tried to locate the source of the plea for help. However, despite my thorough searching, I could see no evidence of anyone in the immediate vicinity, leaving me confused and increasingly alarmed. My dog seemed initially oblivious to whatever was happening, continuing to sniff around the nearby bushes as if nothing unusual was occurring. This made me question whether I might be experiencing some sort of auditory hallucination or mental breakdown. However, when the voice called for help several more times, I noticed my dog's ears suddenly perk up, and his attention turned toward the same area where I believed the sounds were originating. This confirmation from my dog that something was actually happening provided both relief and increased anxiety. At least I knew I wasn't imagining the entire experience, but the reality that something genuinely strange was occurring made the situation feel even more threatening and mysterious. The voice continued to repeat the word help with disturbing consistency and that same muffled quality. As I listened more carefully to these repeated pleas, I began to notice something deeply unsettling about the voice itself. While it initially sounded like a child calling for assistance, closer attention revealed that it didn't quite sound entirely human or natural. The voice seemed to combine qualities of both adult and child vocalizations in a way that created an uncanny valley effect, suggesting something artificial or deliberately disguised. More disturbing, was the complete lack of emotional variation in these calls for help. Each repetition was delivered with exactly the same tone, inflection, and volume, lacking the natural desperation or fear that would characterize genuine pleas for assistance. The mechanical repetition suggested that these weren't authentic cries for help, but rather some sort of deliberate attempt to lure me closer to the vehicles. The realization that someone or something might be using fake distress calls to manipulate my natural impulse to help others filled me with a cold dread that made immediate retreat seem absolutely necessary. My dog and I ran directly home without looking back, and I spent the rest of the evening trying to process what we had experienced and whether we should report the incident to authorities. Despite my mother's skepticism about the necessity of involving police, I continued to worry that someone else might encounter the same disturbing situation and potentially place themselves in danger by responding to what appeared to be calls for help from a child in distress. Story 18. The Window Watcher. My struggle with depression had been a constant companion throughout most of my childhood, creating feelings of worthlessness and isolation that were difficult for a young person to understand or manage. These emotional challenges led me to spend considerable time alone in my bedroom, which was located in the back corner of our family house, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides. The forest setting created natural barriers between our home and the neighbors, providing privacy but also contributing to a sense of isolation that could feel both comforting and ominous. My bedroom was unusually spacious for a child's room, with windows on 2 walls that faced directly into the wooded areas. While this arrangement provided beautiful natural views during daylight hours, it created an atmosphere that felt quite intimidating for a young person, especially during the evening hours when darkness transformed the peaceful woods into an unknown realm full of shadows and mysterious sounds. The supernatural events began when I was approximately 10 years old, during my 5th grade year, when I was still young enough to find comfort in a nightlight, but old enough to feel embarrassed about needing such childish reassurance. My particular nightlight was a sophisticated device with multiple color settings that allowed me to customize the illumination according to my preferences. I had developed a strong attachment to the red setting, finding its warm glow particularly soothing as I settled into sleep each night. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when I woke randomly during the night, which was extremely uncommon for me as I had always been a heavy sleeper who rarely experienced disruptions. While this initial awakening didn't seem particularly significant at the time, I noticed that my nightlight was displaying a different color than the red setting I always selected before going to bed. This color change seemed odd but not necessarily alarming, especially when my parents suggested that the device might be experiencing technical problems common to electronic equipment. Their explanation seemed reasonable, and I accepted their assessment without much concern, assuming that a simple malfunction was responsible for the unexpected blue glow I had discovered that morning. However, the color changes continued to occur with increasing frequency over the following weeks, creating a pattern that seemed too consistent to be explained by random technical failures. Some mornings I would find the light purple, others green or yellow, but never the red setting that I distinctively remembered selecting the previous evening. Each incident prompted discussions with my parents, who maintained their theory about mechanical problems despite the growing evidence that something more deliberate might be occurring. The situation escalated significantly when I discovered my nightlight completely unplugged one morning, sitting on the floor beside its electrical outlet. This physical displacement couldn't be explained by simple electronic malfunctions, suggesting that someone had deliberately removed the device from its connection. When I confronted my parents about this obvious tampering, they continued to insist that they had no involvement in the nightlight's mysterious movements. The tension between my parents and me intensified when the nightlight disappeared entirely several days later. Despite extensive searching throughout the house and repeated questioning of my family members, the device had simply vanished without any logical explanation. This incident created a significant conflict within our household, as I became convinced that my parents were lying to me about their involvement. While they seemed genuinely puzzled by my accusations, my parents suggested that I had probably outgrown the need for a nightlight anyway, implying that my attachment to the device was becoming inappropriate for my age. However, their dismissive attitude felt patronizing and hurtful, especially since the nightlight had provided genuine comfort during a difficult period of my emotional development. The loss of this small security item felt like a violation of my personal space and autonomy. After the nightlight controversy settled, our household returned to relatively normal routines for approximately 1 week. However, this peaceful period was interrupted when I began experiencing random awakenings during the night, something that had never been a problem in my previous sleeping patterns. These mysterious disturbances occurred without any apparent cause, leaving me alert and confused in the darkness of my room. When I reported these sleep disruptions to my parents, they attributed them to natural changes occurring during puberty, explaining that hormonal fluctuations could affect sleeping patterns in growing children. Their medical explanation seemed reasonable, and I accepted their assessment without questioning whether other factors might be responsible for my newfound inability to sleep through the night consistently. However, during one of these nocturnal awakenings, I decided to remain conscious instead of immediately attempting to return to sleep. As I lay quietly in the darkness, straining to identify what might have disturbed my rest, I detected faint rustling sounds emanating from the direction of my closet. These noises were subtle but distinct, suggesting the presence of something or someone moving carefully among my stored belongings. My parents' reaction to this report followed their established pattern of skepticism and dismissal, with my father even conducting a thorough inspection of the closet to demonstrate that nothing unusual was present. His search revealed only the expected collection of old toys, sports equipment, and rolled posters that had accumulated over the years. However, despite this apparent evidence that my concerns were unfounded, the mysterious rustling sounds continued to occur with disturbing regularity. Night after night, I would awaken to the same subtle noises coming from my closet area, creating a pattern of sleep disruption that was beginning to affect my daily functioning and emotional stability. The consistent nature of these disturbances suggested that something real was occurring, even though no physical evidence could be found during daylight investigation. The situation reached its terrifying climax when my father, frustrated by my persistent reports and perhaps beginning to doubt his own explanations, decided to conduct a more aggressive and thorough investigation of my closet. His determination to prove that nothing unusual was happening led him to systematically remove every item from the storage space while expressing his irritation with what he perceived as my overactive imagination. As he methodically cleared toys, games, and equipment from the closet, his movements became increasingly forceful and his voice more stern, reflecting his conviction that this exercise would finally put an end to my supernatural claims. However, when he reached the back wall and began removing some old posters that had been hanging there for years, his confident demeanor changed dramatically. Behind one of these innocent-looking decorations was a hole in the wall that was clearly artificial and large enough for a person to crawl through. The opening extended much deeper than anyone could have expected, disappearing into darkness that our flashlight couldn't fully illuminate. My mother's immediate reaction was to begin screaming while my father rushed outside to investigate the exterior of our house. His outdoor examination revealed a small opening near the foundation of our home, partially concealed by dirt and natural vegetation. Further investigation exposed what appeared to be a tunnel system that provided direct access from the surrounding woods to my bedroom. This discovery explained everything that had been happening: the nightlight manipulations, the nocturnal sounds, and most disturbing of all, the presence of an unknown person who had been entering my sleeping space regularly for over a month. The knowledge that someone had been sharing my bedroom while I slept, watching my daily routines and moving my personal belongings, created a profound sense of violation that affected our entire family. We immediately packed our essential belongings and left that house, staying with relatives until alternative accommodations could be arranged. The incident fundamentally changed our family's sense of security and trust in our living environment. To this day, my parents prefer not to discuss the details of this experience, perhaps carrying guilt about their initial dismissal of my concerns as childhood imagination, rather than legitimate reports of genuine danger. Story 19. The Vanishing Guest. The high school bathroom was typically one of the busiest locations in our building at any given time of day, which made the complete emptiness I encountered that Friday afternoon seem particularly unusual and noteworthy. My friend Emma and I had been walking through the hallways, engaged in her typical animated conversation about topics that I wasn't paying much attention to, when I suddenly felt the urgent need to use the restroom facilities. I asked Emma if she needed to accompany me, but she declined and offered to wait outside the bathroom door until I finished. This arrangement seemed perfectly normal, as we often took brief breaks during our hallway conversations to handle personal needs before continuing with our daily routines. I entered the bathroom expecting to encounter the usual crowd of students, but instead found myself completely alone in the typically bustling space. The unusual emptiness struck me as odd, since this particular restroom was known for being constantly occupied throughout the school day. Students regularly used this location between classes, during lunch periods, and even during class time, when they had obtained permission to leave their assigned rooms. The complete absence of other people felt almost eerie in such a normally social environment. I decided not to dwell on this minor anomaly and proceeded to enter one of the available stalls to take care of my business. As I settled into the small private space and began to relax, I heard the main bathroom door open and close with its characteristic heavy sound. Someone had apparently entered the restroom, though I didn't hear any footsteps or movement after the initial door closure. This lack of subsequent sound seemed slightly unusual, but I didn't immediately consider it cause for concern. Perhaps the person who had entered was simply standing near the door for some reason, possibly checking their appearance in the mirrors or waiting for a friend. Students sometimes used bathrooms as temporary hiding places when they wanted to avoid administrators or escape from uncomfortable social situations. I continued with my personal business while idly reading the various graffiti and messages that students had written on the stall walls over the years. These bathroom writings typically consisted of random quotes, complaints about teachers, declarations of romantic feelings, and the usual collection of teenage thoughts and frustrations expressed in permanent marker and pen ink. After completing my needs and preparing to leave the stall, I heard the bathroom door open and close again, which I interpreted as evidence that whoever had entered earlier had now departed. This seemed to confirm that my brief bathroom companion had been engaged in some quick activity that didn't require much time or create noticeable sounds. As I exited the stall and approached the main bathroom door, I found Emma waiting outside with an expression that I had never seen on her face before. Her typical cheerful demeanor had been replaced by a look of confusion and concern that immediately made me anxious about what she might have witnessed or experienced while waiting for me. When I asked her what was wrong, she responded with a question that made my blood run cold. She wanted to know who had been standing directly behind me in the bathroom stall, positioned so closely that their shoes had been touching mine. According to Emma's account, she had briefly entered the bathroom just before I emerged and had clearly observed 2 sets of feet in the stall I had been occupying. I immediately assured her that no one had been in the stall with me, explaining that I had been completely alone throughout my brief visit to the restroom. However, Emma's expression remained serious and concerned, indicating that she wasn't joking or trying to frighten me with some sort of prank. Her typical personality was playful and lighthearted, making this somber reaction completely out of character. Emma proceeded to explain exactly what she had seen when she entered the bathroom. According to her detailed description, there had definitely been someone standing immediately behind me in the stall, positioned so closely that their feet were touching the back of my shoes. The proximity she described would have meant that this person was standing directly against my body, yet I had felt no physical contact or presence during my time in the stall. She also explained that her immediate reaction to witnessing what appeared to be an intimate situation had been to leave the bathroom quickly, not wanting to intrude on what she assumed was some sort of romantic encounter. However, her explanation raised significant questions about the timeline of events, since I had heard the door open and close twice, which should have accounted for both her entrance and departure. When I described hearing someone enter the bathroom earlier but never hearing them leave, Emma insisted that no one had approached the door at any time during her wait outside. According to her observation, the bathroom had remained empty until she briefly entered just moments before I emerged. This contradiction between our experiences created a disturbing puzzle that neither of us could easily explain. The implications of Emma's account were deeply unsettling, suggesting that someone or something had been sharing the small stall space with me without my knowledge or awareness. The physical impossibility of someone standing so close to me without my detection, combined with the unexplained timeline discrepancies, created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that affected both of us. I found a school administrator and reported the incident, hoping that there might be a logical explanation involving security cameras or known issues with the building's facilities. However, the administrator's response was dismissive, suggesting that Emma was probably playing a prank, or that we had misunderstood what had happened. The official's casual attitude contrasted sharply with our genuine concern and confusion about the experience. Emma's serious demeanor and detailed description convinced me that something genuinely unexplainable had occurred in that bathroom stall. Her typically jovial personality and tendency toward humor made her somber reaction particularly credible, as she had never shown interest in ghost stories or supernatural topics before this incident. The experience fundamentally changed my perspective on the possibility of paranormal activity, transforming me from a skeptic into someone who acknowledges that unexplainable events can occur in ordinary locations. Years later, I still remember the chilling details of Emma's account and the impossible nature of what she claimed to have witnessed. Story 20. The Underground Substance Network. The gas station incident began several months ago when I started noticing an unusual pattern of activity at my neighbor's house during my nightly cigarette breaks on the balcony. My smoking habit and irregular sleep schedule had created a routine of late-night observations that gradually revealed suspicious behavior, occurring in the darkness of our quiet residential neighborhood. From my elevated position on the balcony, I had a clear view over my neighbor's fence into his backyard and driveway area. Under normal circumstances, only a navy blue BMW was parked in his driveway, suggesting that he lived alone and maintained a relatively simple lifestyle. However, on this particular evening, I noticed a black van that I had never seen before positioned in front of his house. Initially, this observation didn't seem particularly significant or concerning. Neighbors occasionally have visitors, contractors, or family members who drive different vehicles, so the presence of an unfamiliar van could have been explained by numerous innocent circumstances. However, my natural curiosity and tendency toward obsessive observation led me to pay closer attention to this anomaly over the following nights. The black van appeared again the next evening and then repeatedly throughout the week, establishing a pattern that suggested regular, scheduled visits rather than random social calls or service appointments. My interest in this mystery grew stronger each night, transforming what had begun as casual observation into a deliberate surveillance activity that occupied increasing amounts of my attention and time. I began timing my balcony visits to coincide with the van's appearances, hoping to gather more information about the purpose of these regular nocturnal meetings. This nightly routine became a source of entertainment and intrigue, providing a distraction from my personal problems while feeding my obsessive personality traits that had previously driven friends away from our relationships. The situation escalated dramatically when I witnessed something that transformed my casual curiosity into genuine concern about potentially criminal activity. During one of my very late night observations, around 5 in the morning, I saw my neighbor emerge from his house carrying what appeared to be a long black bag of considerable weight and awkward dimensions. The bag's size and shape initially reminded me of a golf club carrying case, but the obvious difficulty my neighbor experienced while transporting it suggested that the contents were much heavier and more cumbersome than sporting equipment. His careful, deliberate movements indicated that whatever was inside required gentle handling, possibly due to fragility or the sensitive nature of the materials. I watched as he opened the van's sliding door and carefully placed the mysterious bag inside before climbing into the driver's seat and departing quickly into the early morning darkness. This behavior seemed suspicious enough to warrant continued observation, though I wasn't yet ready to consider involving law enforcement or taking any direct action based on my amateur surveillance activities. The following evening, I positioned myself on the balcony earlier than usual and waited for the van to arrive, bringing my laptop to pass time while maintaining watch over my neighbor's property. The vehicle appeared around 1 o'clock in the morning and sat idling in the driveway for several minutes, as if the occupants were conducting some sort of preparation or coordination activities. Eventually, the driver emerged and retrieved the same black bag from the van's interior, though this time he appeared to be struggling significantly more with its weight. His visible effort to avoid dropping or damaging the bag suggested that its contents had become heavier or more fragile since the previous night's transport, raising additional questions about the nature of these mysterious materials. After several more nights of observation, I made the decision to follow the van when it departed, hoping to discover the destination and purpose of these regular trips. I waited until approximately 4 in the morning, then quickly gathered my car keys and positioned my vehicle to begin surveillance when the van pulled out of the neighborhood. The journey led through unfamiliar areas for about 20 minutes before the van turned onto a dirt road that appeared to lead into a wooded region. I followed carefully, maintaining distance to avoid detection, until we reached what appeared to be an abandoned gas station hidden in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The location seemed deliberately isolated and difficult to access, suggesting activities that required privacy and secrecy. I observed my neighbor's BMW, already parked at this remote location, confirming that this was a planned meeting point rather than a random destination. The coordination between the van and car indicated an organized operation involving multiple participants and careful scheduling, lending credibility to my growing suspicions about illegal activity. After waiting approximately 1 hour in my concealed position, I saw the BMW depart the area, prompting me to investigate the abandoned gas station more closely. I approached on foot, hoping to gather evidence or information about what was occurring at this remote location during these nocturnal meetings. The gas station building appeared genuinely abandoned, with locked doors and windows that showed no signs of recent legitimate business activity. However, when I attempted to gain entry by breaking one of the windows, an alarm system immediately activated, suggesting that despite its derelict appearance, the building was equipped with modern security measures. I fled immediately and contacted emergency services, providing a vague report about suspicious activity at the remote location. The next morning revealed the consequences of my amateur investigation, as multiple police vehicles surrounded my neighbor's house with flashing lights while officers escorted him away in handcuffs. Despite my attempts to obtain information from law enforcement about the nature of the criminal activity I had helped uncover, the police have consistently refused to provide details about their investigation or the charges against my former neighbor. Story 21. The Demon Under the Bed. Throughout my adult life, I had never experienced sleep disorders, night terrors, or sleep paralysis, making me one of those fortunate individuals who enjoyed consistently peaceful and uninterrupted rest. My natural tendency toward heavy sleeping meant that external noises or disturbances rarely affected my ability to maintain deep sleep throughout the night, creating a reliable pattern of restorative rest that I had taken for granted. I was sharing a living space with my roommate Patricia, whom I affectionately called Trish, and our different work schedules meant that we maintained separate daily routines and rarely encountered each other except during weekend hours. This arrangement worked well for both of us, providing the independence and privacy that young adults often prefer while sharing living expenses and household responsibility. The disturbing events began during July, when the summer heat required me to run my window air conditioning unit at maximum capacity throughout the night hours. The powerful cooling system created a consistent white noise that actually enhanced my sleeping experience, providing a steady background sound that masked any minor disturbances from neighboring apartments or street activity. My first supernatural nightmare occurred several days after a difficult breakup with my former boyfriend, during a period when my emotional state was already fragile and my life circumstances felt particularly challenging. The dream itself was largely forgettable and vague, but one specific element remained vivid and disturbing long after I awakened from the frightening experience. In this initial nightmare, I found myself surrounded by family members who were seated quietly around a dinner table in what appeared to be a formal dining room setting. Standing across from me was a creature that resembled the aliens from science fiction movies, but with the addition of prominent horns and razor-sharp claws that gave it a demonic appearance rather than merely extraterrestrial. The entity's presence felt malevolent and threatening, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated every aspect of the dream environment. As the nightmare progressed, this demon-like creature moved closer to me until it was standing directly beside my chair, looking down at me with an intensity that felt both predatory and invasive. I attempted to escape from this terrifying presence by running away, which transported me to what my sleeping mind interpreted as my bedroom, though it differed from my actual room in various subtle ways that dreams often create. The nightmare concluded when I awakened in my real bedroom, finding myself in complete darkness with the air conditioning unit operating at full volume. My heart was racing from the intensity of the dream experience, and I took several moments to orient myself in the familiar surroundings of my actual room before convincing myself that it had merely been an unusually vivid nightmare. After looking around to reassure myself that I was safe and alone, I managed to fall back asleep without further incident. The following night brought another disturbing development when I awakened to find my bedroom door standing open, which contradicted my usual habit of keeping it closed during sleep, unless I had been drinking alcohol earlier in the evening. My immediate assumption was that Trish had checked on me for some reason, perhaps to verify whether I was home or to borrow something from my room. However, when I asked Trish about this incident the next day, she insisted that she hadn't entered my room at all during the night. While it remained possible that I had made a midnight trip to the bathroom or kitchen that I couldn't remember, the unexplained door opening created a minor sense of unease that lingered throughout the following day. The third night brought another nightmare featuring the same demonic entity, but this time the dream was significantly more disturbing and violent than the previous experience. Instead of being surrounded by family members, I found myself trapped alone with the creature in a dark, empty room where it could approach me without any interference or protection from others. The demon moved closer to me with the same supernatural gliding motion I had noticed in the first nightmare, never appearing to use its limbs for locomotion, but somehow covering distance until it was positioned directly on top of me. In this vulnerable position, I felt completely paralyzed and unable to defend myself as the creature extended one of its claws toward my thigh. The sensation of the claw scratching my skin felt remarkably real and painful, creating a level of physical awareness that seemed unusual for a dream experience. The pain felt genuine and immediate, as if actual injury was occurring rather than merely being imagined by my sleeping mind. The nightmare continued beyond this point, but my memory of subsequent events remained unclear and fragmented. When I awakened from the second nightmare, I immediately noticed a stinging sensation on my upper thigh that corresponded exactly to where the demon had scratched me in the dream. The physical pain seemed too real and specific to be explained as a psychosomatic response to dream content, prompting me to investigate whether actual injury had occurred. I rushed to the bathroom and examined my thigh in the mirror, discovering to my horror that there was indeed a visible gash in my skin that matched the location and sensation I remembered from the nightmare. This discovery prompted me to scream loudly enough to wake Trish, who came running to investigate the source of my distress. Trish's immediate question about how I had sustained such an injury reflected the same confusion and alarm that I was experiencing. We conducted a thorough search of my bed and bedroom, looking for any sharp objects, insects, or other possible explanations for the mysterious wound, but found nothing that could account for the injury. During our investigation, Trish suddenly gestured for silence and turned off my air conditioning unit, eliminating the white noise that had been masking other sounds in the room. In the resulting quiet, we both clearly heard subtle noises coming from underneath my bed, the kind of faint sounds that indicate another person's presence in a confined space. Rather than screaming or confronting the intruder immediately, we both managed to control our terror long enough to leave the room quietly and exit our apartment entirely. We sought help from a neighboring tenant, explaining our situation and requesting assistance with what was clearly a serious safety emergency. While waiting for police to arrive, we heard what sounded like our apartment door slamming shut, suggesting that the intruder had become aware of our discovery and had fled the scene. When law enforcement officers searched our apartment, they confirmed that the intruder was no longer present, though evidence of their extended presence remained. The realization that someone had been hiding under my bed for multiple nights, possibly weeks, fundamentally changed my understanding of the nightmares I had been experiencing. The demonic creature in my dreams had apparently been my mind's interpretation of the very real human predator who had been sharing my sleeping space and had actually injured me during one of these nocturnal visits.